Welcome to my channel for my very first Paintman Journeying video. I am the Paintman Journeying. This is going to be my new home for showing everyone my journey through learning and painting miniatures. I've been miniature painting since I was 16, so I've been at it for 20 years, but there's always more to learn and practice, always something to test and play with, new tools to help me organize or pull off better effects, and so many tutorials I can use to learn from the giants of painting I look up to. Being that this is my first video, I'm just going to show it off my painting process as it is right now, starting from right after the model gets pulled off the printer. It's going to be in 3 parts because I'm not the fastest of painters, and I'll be painting this wonderful Orc Necromancer from Artisans Guild on Patreon. So my usual method for getting supports off of models after I 3D print them is I'll take a very sharp knife, usually a new blade if I need one, and I will just cut a ring or the edge supports off as flat as possible. Once I get those, I'll generally tear it off and then clean up by scraping away any of the extra nubs. This is easy on bases because nobody sees that bottom part, but when it comes to an actual model like this one, I like to be a bit more careful, and so I'll be very slow about taking off those edge ones. Sometimes even when I get a full tree of supports done, I'll just rip that tree off so I don't have it in the way and I can get a little bit deeper. And then once I've got kind of most of the edges that I can reach, or wherever I can reach, I will gently tug at the model until the other supports come off. Now you want to be, especially with a thin one like this bone guy, you want to be really careful to be gentle with it and cut anything that's not coming off. And in this case, there was kind of a bridge support and I used the knife to get rid of it until it came off. And then once they're off the sprue, like this one here, I will go and feel with my hand to see where any bumps and stuff are that I might not be able to see immediately. And then once I find them, just go along with the knife, taking everything off very, very carefully. And then this is kind of where you can flatten the model so that there's no gaps or bumps as best you can from those supports. And then once I have what I think is everything off, sometimes I do miss some, but I'll load my airbrush up with water and just spray off anything that remains. And I do that to make sure none of the little bits stick to them when I bake them. To put this guy together, it was a simple task of just gluing the hands on, because those were the only parts that were separate, because it is modular hands. In this case though, because it needed to line up with the base, I had to get him kind of held to the base with one hand and then line up how it's going to be glued on with the other. And then once I had the base lined up, held it in place, made sure I got the bottom part correct, and then got my glue out, added some glue to the hand, made sure I held it completely in place for this because I didn't want it to move out of position, because this is where it was going to go on the base in the end, but I was having it on a different base for painting. So just once I got the glue in, held it there, made sure it was in position so that would all match up later. Once it dried and I got him on the temporary base, it was time to decide how I wanted to paint this guy. To start things off, I'm going to base coat him black. Then for his skin, start with a dark purple, but use the airbrush to highlight all the way up to an orc skin green. For the spell effects, I want to keep it with that necromantic teal, but where those skulls are, add a pop of yellow just to change the tone. For the armor, I want to keep it dark, so over that black base coat, I'm going to add some dark blue and then highlight the edges up to those lighter blues. Now I can't say for sure what natural orc hair color is, but in our case, I'm going to use a dark brown, adding some khaki to get the highlights on the very tips. For the bone, that one's simple. We're just going to use bone colors, which is, normally a khaki up to white, and then the same for the leather. Just a simple red leather should finish it off. For the primer, I usually use an airbrush. In this case, I also have a pre-mixed prime. So this is scale 75 black primer. However, I've thinned it with water and scale 75 thinner. I do what's called a primer prime or something like that, where essentially I dust the model to begin with. And what this is going to do is it's going to add kind of this little dusty layer of the black primer, and that'll give the primer itself something to adhere to later on when I start priming the model more in depth. Once that first coat's dry, when I do start the actual priming, I'll go piece by piece. Instead of trying to do an overall coat of the model, I'll make sure a section is coated completely from every angle before I move on. So I would start with like the leg and then go to the arm. And this way I have kind of full control to make sure I'm not missing any gaps. I'm focused in a single area to make sure I don't miss a thing. On my palette, I'm starting with Kimera Kolors Violet, the Phthalo Green, the Red Oxide, the Yellow Oxide, and the Cold Yellow. Now, Kimera Kolors is new to me. I haven't actually used them before, so this is my first test model with them, which means this is going to be a kind of review of these colors as well. I start off by mixing the violet, so this is going to be the base of our orc skin. And I start with the violet, and because these are single pigment paints, you got to really heavily mix them. So I added, well, not heavily mix them, but you can mix them, and that's what I wanted to test and try and do. The airbrush I'll be using is an Infinity CR Plus from Harder and Steinbeck, I think is their name. And I'll be just adding a few drops of thinner and then the paint straight from the palette into the brush. This is just a base coat for the model, so I test it on my hand first just to make sure that there's a bit of flow. And then I just start generally painting the areas that I'm going to want to be the dark green. Almost dropped it there, but I'm alright. Quick reflexes. This one, so this will take a couple coats because it is a thin paint, and I did thin it quite a bit. And so I'll just go over all the parts that are skinned. So his hand, his arm, his face, his other hand, and his leg is sticking out of a bit of the armor at the bottom there. So that's why I got those ones. I do go over this a couple times because it is thin, and this is when I remembered that I actually have a hobby holder, and this will give it the proper base that we need in order to get started on the green. Since this is the first time I use these paints, I want to show you the struggle I've had with this green. Now, it's not technically the green's fault, which I've researched later and figured out why it happened, and it was mostly due to the time that I got it shipped to me. And so I figured something like this might happen. But what happens is, so I'm mixing up the Kimera green, bit of red to give it a bit kind of that purple tone that I was going to go with. And then I sprayed my model with it. Now at first I was having a hard time getting it to even come out of the airbrush, which is weird because I've thinned it like a heck of a whole bunch. And so I was just going to do a general spray from a single angle, and as you can see, I can't get it out. I'm having problems. I clean the brush as best I can. I do the needle tip, even funnel water through it, and I get it back together, and it's kind of back into working order again. Try my green again, and this time just going straight green, not even worrying about the mix, having a hard time getting it out, and when it does come out, it came out in a whole bunch. Started spraying again, and this is where I can kind of tell there was something wrong, because it would come out really dark but then dry really light. Added some yellow, and even with that it would still be hard to spray and come out chalky. The problem ended up being the green. It had gone through a freeze and thaw cycle, being shipped in the winter, and ended up ruining the paint. So I had to switch out the Kimera green for one I knew work, which is my artist color, Sap Green. They are the same pigment, although they do look a little bit different. And there you can see in my testing how the one came out darker where the other one was chalky. So I rebased the model in the purple, and then I started again using the sap green. And in this case, I was a bit lazy, didn't even bother wanting to mix. I just wanted to make sure that this worked. So I put in my thinner. And in this case, I also use a bit of water because the sap green isn't as matte as the Kimera Kolors had been thus far. And so the water will help keep it matte even with that thinner in there. And then this one came out nicer from the airbrush, and coated much better and in a color I expected. So this was supposed to be the first layer, which would be a dark green, and so I expected it to remain dark, whereas in that original one it didn't stay dark at all. And so in this I was doing some mixes to find out which yellow would work better for green. So I have a bit of both, a bit of one, a bit of the other, and in this case I found the cold yellow makes a nicer kind of orc green, whereas using the yellow oxide would have been a bit more muddy, or let's say more like a camo green, which is, I didn't want that for the orc. And so I just started with the sap green with a little bit of this yellow, made a thin mix in my brush, and then we would use this to build up on the model itself. So even with that yellow, this is just a bit of it, and this is just to build up layers from the angle. So I'm leaving the very deep recesses as in that dark purple, and this will just kind of give me the base green that I need on top of that. Here I add a bit more yellow, and this is where you'll see me get a bit more specific in the details. So here I'm keeping the brush close and only spraying on the highest edges where I want the paint to go. And it's very thin, so this is going to take a couple layers. Usually what I'll do is I'll spray and then dry with a bit of air, no paint coming out, and then do that over and over until I'm happy with the color that came out. And then I just do it over all the different green parts. Here you can see how specific I am with building up those layers. Get one down, spray it, dry it, spray it, dry it, so on and so forth. Here I'm adding more yellow to that green mixture, even kind of starting a new little pool, just because this is the one I'm going to be working out to get those highlights on the orc skin brighter and brighter. Here there was still some of the darker left in the airbrush, and so I percolated it a bit, and that just means to flow the air backwards in order to basically flush that out and have it mix within the chamber itself. And here is where I get very specific with this brighter highlight, and so I only do it from a specific angle, and I get the airbrush right in there. Make sure that the flow is good before I even try getting it on the model, and highlight those upper edges of the muscles as best I can. Adding a big glob of yellow now, just because we're going to be working up to the final highlight. In this one, there is a lot of thinner in there, so it looks very bright, but it is quite thin, and so we'll take a couple layers just to get on those very edges. And in this case, I kind of contort myself to make sure I've got the exact angle I want, just to hit the top edges. And then that concludes the airbrushing part of the orc skin. Now with the purple on the palette, this is where I want to kind of line in where the recesses of the violet, because the airbrush would cover a lot more than you expect sometimes, especially like the wrinkles in the face. And so in this case, I'm using a very small brush, very thin tip. I think it's a gold Green Stuff World 0. And I like these kind of brushes because they're long bristles. Now I use some thinner with this to keep the paint very thin, and because the idea here is I want to keep the flow of the paint incredibly smooth, which is very hard in my dry climate, but I also want to keep the point very still because I'm only hitting tiny edges. And I prefer doing it this way than a wash because I can be very precise about where these go and add texture lines if I need to. And you kind of see that right here where there's a line in the muscle to separate those two muscles out, and then I only put a little bit on the tip of the brush and blend it out as I go. And then again here, this is where I'm adding some more texture. I also made a mistake and I accidentally got some of the darker paint on here, so I figured, this is a good spot, and I just added some of the violet and red mix in order to get these skin spots on his muscle. Heading into the blue now, to my palette, I'm adding Carbon Black and Phthalo Blue Red Shade. So this is for the dark armor. In this case, I start with the Phthalo Blue, but I don't want to go that bright yet, so I add black to it just to darken it out. And then using my brush, this is a base layer. And so for the most part, this is just some simple base coating, getting every part of the armor that I need to get. However, in some places I do leave it dark, like behind the boots and wherever the shadows would be, because if the black's already there, why cover it up? I also do a bit of loaded brush blending in that case. So here where I want to keep those dark recesses of that upper pad dark, I'm adding the blue to my brush, but then adding a tip of black. So you'll see it here, just a little tip, and then I use that to start the deep shade, so in this case the opposite side of the boot, and then blend it out on the model to the original mix I was going with, and that gives me my base coat. So just going around the model now, deciding every single part that I want to be blue. For this next part, I'm going to need a finer brush, and so here's my brush collection. You can see I have all the green stuff were all golds, and I choose the smallest one, which is the 0, to give me the finest point. So with that 0, I'm taking just the raw blue, I'm highlighting just the edges. So you kind of gotta think of this as almost like how GW paints their dark Eldar. And so I want to keep the armor dark, but I do want to get to those very light points, and so I'm only doing the edges and anywhere that I feel could be just a little bit brighter. So along this part in particular, it's just that, but I do add, because this is a rounded plate, kind of a highlight more in the center. Now here's where I start to do something a little bit different, which is to add water from the palette. So just straight water. There's no paint on my brush, to wet the area before I put on some of the blue. And this just helps thin the paint on the model itself so that I can keep a nice transition between the pure blue and the dark blue. Because if I were to just put it on, you can actually tell kind of the difference a lot more than it seems like here. By the way, the smoke that you're seeing in this shot is actually a humidifier that I keep on my table. It's just a small little humidifier, but I live in a very dry climate, and if I don't do this, my paint dries on my brush almost immediately, and I'm bringing it to the model even, and so I would get one highlight and have to redo my brush again. And so the humidifier just in the area helps keep it wet and keeps my palette wet a little bit longer too. I'm probably in one of the few places where even having a wet palette, it'll still dry out. So here is where you can really see the effect I'm going for with just using the bare water. So on the leg plate, I use water just from the palette to moisten the area to begin with. Then take a single drop on the tip of my brush of the blue, highlight the edge, and then pull the paint around in that wet area in order to create a transition between that and the black. Here again, I'm just doing it one more time in the deeper part from a different angle so you can see it again. And now it looks very striking while it's still wet, but it should dry a little bit darker. Now I decided to do the skulls of the armor, the blue as well. I could have painted them bone, but in this case I wanted more of the blue just to keep the model darker. And for this, I'm trying to just get the raised edges, so keeping a very sharp tip and only hitting the points that I think would catch highlights. Now it's time to get the contrast up, so I add white to my palette, again the Kimera white. And in this I'm using to mix with the blue. I also mix in a little black because it's a little too vibrant for me. So you'll see here, I take a bit of the black and add it in, and that'll, in black and white, make gray. And so this will just desaturate that blue a little bit and keep it kind of within reason, or the reason I think. So with this, it's just edge highlighting now. So I take my sharp brush and using the edge when I can, go around any of the sharp edges of the model that would be hit from my light source. So in this case, I'm imagining the light source coming in from the front of his right arm there that's held up. On this knee pad, I did want to make sure that the colors blended a little bit. Otherwise it might end up being too sharp, and then the skull kind of has these rounded edges. So again, I just start with some water on the model, which would make it easier to blend as I put the highlights on. Now this is a spot where my inconsistency with painting really kind of shines through. So normally for edges like these, you would want to use the edge of the brush in order to just highlight the very edges. But it looks like here I've decided to follow the edges with the brush, dragging it along. I mean, both work. This one's a little. If you make a mistake, you'll definitely see it. Whereas if you use the edge at the right angle, it should theoretically follow the straight line of the model. But I'm just inconsistent in this way, and sometimes I'll use the edge, sometimes I'll try manually highlighting the edge, I guess is the best way to describe it. Like here, I'm kind of using the edge for the downward parts, and then the tip for the very top tip of the armor. Now that that's done, I just continue in this way, adding a bit more white to the blue and black mix. And then in this case, I want to keep it very controlled and very minor in the additions I'm making here. So I'm only adding dots in most cases, especially on the skull at the front here. You'll see that I'm just kind of touching the brush to the model, barely even using strokes, just adding dots to the upper edges. And then now that that's done, I wanted to add a bit more shadow to the depth where I may have missed it. So I'm just doing kind of another little deep water wash where I add a bunch of water to the model, a tip of black on my brush, and this is the thicker brush as well. I'm just kind of doing a controlled wash essentially into the parts that I want to keep really dark and shadowed. Especially on the hand here, you can kind of see exactly how I get just a bit of black, move it around, but try not to cover the upper edges with it. And there we go, the blue is done. So it was a shame about the green Kimera color. Now, I don't blame the company in this case. The issue is the fault of the Canadian winter, and all the other colors made it out just fine. So it's just this one that I'd have to replace. From what I could research online, chalkiness happens when the acrylic polymer breaks down. The pigments aren't suspended in it properly, and instead they loosely bind to the surface, creating a powdery texture. This can happen from UV radiation, so if you leave it out in the sun too long, or in my case, many freeze and thaw cycles degrading the acrylic. There's not really many fixes either, since the polymer is just bad now. I mixed in some medium and it helped a bit, but that obviously only goes so far because it thins out the pigments as well. Thanks for watching all the way through part 1 of this series, and I'll see you again in part 2.